Welcome to The Chain, a podcast created and produced by ASCM, the Association for Supply Chain Management. I'm Abe Eshkenazi, CEO of ASCM. Some of you listening today may have heard some of the previous episodes called The Rebound. I co-hosted The Rebound with my colleague, Bob Treblecock. 70 episodes, Bob and I invited supply chain subject matter experts to explore the world of supply chain in a post-COVID world. These episodes are still available. I encourage you to listen to them. After a brief hiatus, I'm excited to share that we have a new podcast called The Chain and hosted by yours truly. The idea for this podcast and its name stemmed from the creation and production of our soon-to-be-released documentary, The Chain. The docuseries is a visual exploration of how supply chains connect us all in this complicated world. When complete, there's going to be 6 episodes that trace 4 distinct products through their unique supply chains. I'm so pleased to be joined today by the creative minds that help make The Chain possible. Stephen Green, Adam Orwing, John Blystone, and John Ormond from WAG Entertainment. Welcome, everyone. Steve, why don't you start introducing you and the team, please?
Hi, my name's Stephen Green, and I'm the MD of WAG Entertainment and the exec producer of The Chain.
Hi, I'm John Ormond. I'm the series producer on The Chain.
Second, John.
And I am John Blystone. I'm one of the producer directors working on The Chain.
And Adam, please.
And I'm Adam Ewing, and I am an edit director who worked on The Chain.
Welcome, gentlemen. I am so excited to have this time to talk to you about the documentary and what we learned and what you learned about it. So let's jump in and talk about it. The Chain. Stephen, give me a little bit of sense of what the docuseries is all about.
Yeah, so The Chain's a 6-part series that takes viewers inside supply chain. And each episode has a theme like food or transport. And each episode begins with an event. So for the food episode, we begin with the World Food Championships in Dallas, Texas, and a team making a hamburger. They're going in for the world's best hamburger competition. And then to get us into supply chain, we look at the 4 key components that made that moment possible. So for our food episode, it's where does a bun come from, beef patty, the salad, and the tomato ketchup. So we dive into the story of each item, which is a supply chain story, and look at the complications, the connections, the issues, and the solutions that bring that product to market through people who run supply chains.
The inspiration and the vision for the documentary came from ASCM. However, WAG previously developed a series on a segment of the supply chain, specifically the port disruptions. When you were doing it, did you see a story that needed to be told when we approached WAG?
I think so. Adam also worked on that show, and I think when we were making it, we we struggled to fit everything in. You think, what do you choose, and what do you put in? There's a much bigger story here, and the kind of genre of documentary making about how things are made. No one's ever really looked at it as a supply chain story, which is what it is. So yeah, I think certainly when we were making that, we could see there was something far bigger to be made.
It's because every time you look at one element of the supply chain and take for granted, Stephen, you were just mentioning the bun there, and we talk about how the wheat is harvested in Kansas, and that's the beginning of our bun's sort of supply chain story. But then you've got to think about the combine harvester that chops the wheat, and that's got its own supply chain story. And then the farmer sat driving the combine harvester, he's wearing clothes. They've got their own supply chain story.
Making a show on this subject, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead, is all about knowing where to begin and where to end in the story you're telling, because the extended supply chain means that it's almost endless where you can take a story. And so, trying to cram it into when we first started talking into the bit about borders, it's just so much bigger. And I mean, even 6 episodes for this series is not enough to really contain all the things that as a team we've talked about and with yourself when we were making the show.
Dig into it a little bit more. Adam, you brought up the concept of interconnected. Were you surprised how interconnected the supply chains were?
Definitely on previous series and now on The Chain. it doesn't matter what subject matter you pick from our modern world. Once you start to peel the layers back like an onion, it just goes on and it just goes on. So, and it was surprising. I mean, we all understand the idea and the concept of food miles and things like that. But I think when you get into things like clothing and you discover that it's grown here, but it sails there to be manufactured, and then it comes back, and then it's printed here and then sent over there. And we don't think about it until you're actually asked to investigate it and look a bit deeper. And then you realize how much you are actually missing. And I think that's what makes us guys very interested as producers, directors, is that every time you look, there's another layer and another layer to investigate. And Steve's point is fair, that you've just got to know when to chop.
I think look, the fact that we found sort of so much of this content surprising is just evidences how the audience will find this surprising. That this isn't something that really has been made as a documentary before. There hasn't been something that actually takes manufacturing and process and looks at it through the lens of supply chain. So I think really what the series will do is actually really give an audience an insight into something they maybe know a little bit about from the news or from newspapers, but not to the depth that this series takes them.
The other area that I found interesting, and through the documentary and our discussion with you, is the global nature of it. We tend to think of products as fairly simple, whether it's a T-shirt. How difficult is it to make a T-shirt? But yet, when you started to unwind the process and how far a T-shirt travels before it gets to the store, that really, hit home for me about how connected the global supply chain is.
Absolutely. That came across, I think, in our communications episode as well, where you look at the fact that the mobile phone has gone hundreds of thousands of miles before you turn it on. And also the fact that each element of that, there are hubs, specialist hubs all over the world that do their own thing, and they do it the best. And so you go there. They do it the best and the cheapest, the most efficiently. And so things will be shipped across the world to them to do that bit and then back again. I mean, it's an extraordinary example of actually, cooperation the world over.
I think that's you mentioned shipping there, John, and that to me was something that I found mind-blowing when we first started delving into supply chain subject matters. Was I never even thought about cargo ships, humongous container ships sailing the oceans. I knew they existed, but they were just in the background. And then when you actually investigate how modern products and how the modern supply chain works, you realize just how integral these giant ships are, hence the problems we've seen with canals and what have you, and the repercussions from that. But most people don't even think about container shipping, and yet probably 90% of everything in their house is from a container ship.
And just the amazing invention of the container, which you think happened, I think, in the 50s, didn't it? That you stopped loading bale by bale onto the ships. Our modern world would not be possible without that.
Oftentimes, we assume that stuff just shows up at our doorstep after we order it. And I think most consumers, they now understand the term supply chain, but rarely do they understand all the complexity and the individuals that are, responsible for it. And that was one of the things that came through in the documentary, is the number of individuals that touch and that are impacted by the supply chain. Give me a sense of what you saw when you started to see this as a people story as well as a product story.
Well, that was one of the interesting things, though, wasn't it? It's like how many people and how far down the chain goes. And it's all people all the way, whether it's the people working in the fields or the factories or the people who are involved with the transportation. It just covers everyone. Everyone touches it at some point. And therefore, that's why we wanted it, the items that we chose, to be so relatable to the people who buy them, that they can understand that what process had to go through.
I mean, ultimately, supply chain's a consumer story. It's about where your stuff comes from. This is about it's about the cost to not just the financial cost of the stuff you get, but the cost to the environment. It's everything to do with the things you buy is supply chain. And actually, we buy very blindly. We don't really think about where things come from. There's an abundance of things in shops, and we're very lucky. We live in a time of plenty, and for most of us, we live in a time of plenty. I think, but it makes us sort of slightly complacent, actually, But again, this story is about who's on the back end of the supply chain, which is the consumer.
So let's back up. Let me get into your business for a second here. Can you describe the production process and some of the criticals that you needed to make in telling the story? You talked about the individuals and the products. How do you tell a story about supply chain?
Oh God, it's really hard. The four of us have a lot of arguments.
Well, I think the key thing was finding the identity, choosing the items was the kind of the main starting point there. We had the kind of 6 kind of topics that we wanted to cover, but then within those it was finding relatable items that told a good story. And sometimes it was more straightforward. The communications, of course, you want to talk about semiconductors and the mobile phone, but then there are other stories where we could have gone anywhere. With food, we went through lots of different items about, do we tell the story of, the Christmas dinner? Do we tell the story of various different dishes? And you could have told numerous stories.
Because you mustn't forget, what we're talking about here is a documentary series for distribution internationally. And one of the things that we had to consider is what feels international. Food is very easy. Everyone eats. So, food's very relatable. We all love hamburgers. Transport, which is another episode, very relatable. We all travel by car, bus, plane. But then it gets a bit trickier further down when you're trying to find themes and ideas that are relatable internationally. And I think like sport, there's an episode on sport, which was your swap, Abe. We originally had energy, I think, was something down there, which we all sort of slightly disagreed on whether we should do it. I was quite obsessed with that as an idea. You said, maybe not. Why don't we look at sport? Sport actually turned out to be a really great episode because it got us into doing some very different stories. But the question for that episode is what's internationally interesting in sport? We really wanted soccer, and we had some good leads on some stadiums that we thought we would get in, but just couldn't do it. So we did settle and end up doing American football. But it's a very long-winded way of saying this is a show that people are going to watch. So you have to make it appeal broadly as possible for as many people with subjects that they will all find relatable.
Did you find it easy to unwind the supply chain of a particular product? Give me a sense of that. I mean, you guys source all the way to recycle and reuse. Give me a sense of that.
No, we didn't. And I think, look, you manufacture a product, you don't want how you manufacture it on the internet or someone in your press team to just tell you. The recipe for Coke is not freely available. Oddly, when we do the episode on healthcare, you can't find out how medical morphine is made very easily, can you, John?
No.
No,
or for instance, can we come into your chip factory, please, and film your chip making process? And unbelievably, nobody was keen to have us in because, of course, these are secrets, and these are billion-dollar secrets that
this also relates to, the inspiration of these programs. How do you get them made? From my point of view, I come on board when these guys have gone out, they've shot all the interviews, they've shot all of the pictures we need, and then it comes to me, and then I'm reliant on the experts and the interviews that have been conducted. So I've got a script that everybody's sort of followed roughly. They've got the shots needed. They've done the interviews based on the subject matters. And then it comes to us guys and we go, right, what have they actually said? And does it ring true with what we thought? And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time, it takes you on to a next level. And that's why they're the experts. That's why they're the professors. That's why they're the supply chain managers. And you hear it from the horse's mouth. And then you start working out, okay, where would this fit best? Where would it have the most impact? I never knew that. I never knew that. Let's put that in there. And you start building together this sort of jigsaw puzzle of interviews in order to create something, hopefully cohesive, but that takes people on a sort of narrative journey across all the subject matters and across the supply chain.
Stephen, I'm not sure if it was you or John that referenced, sort of the centers of excellence that are being developed all over the world, for various products and services. Give me a sense of, your, insight in terms of seeing these, very efficient locations, whether it be in Japan or China or in the US, and some of the risks associated with the single point failure issues that you're uncovering, because we saw it a lot in the episodes that what makes supply chains efficient is economies of scale. And so you need to have that infrastructure necessary to support that particular manufacturing process or whatever, supply chain it is. Give me a sense of what your perspective is when you saw these centers of excellence, the risks associated with those centers of excellence. Give me a sense of what you guys saw there.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that, it was very interesting. Number one, how much cooperation there is and how many, I mean, we're looking at a system that has, I guess, evolved really since the 50s. So you've had decades for people to move into their areas of expertise and to nail those down. Obviously, what that means is, for instance, in the case of Japan, who, like going back to our chips, they make the nicest wafers. And if you have a tsunami hit Japan, all of a sudden your wafers, everybody's wafers are interrupted because everybody's getting their wafers from Japan. So, I mean, that actually is quite surprising in a way. I had not anticipated that there would be so many kind of single hubs of excellence that are necessary to deliver us all these things at the price we want, at the speed we want. Some of what that brings is this incredible sense of scale that I want to bring out as well. That absolutely gobsmacked me, really, that you think of the quantities, for instance, that mines are producing, that clothing factories are making, that the sheer volume is something to behold. And I mean, it's a testament to all the people working in the supply chain that these massive volumes continue to move through day by day and week by week. So all of us little individuals all over the world get what we want when we need it.
I think we didn't quite put it in the show, but that we'd read that. I don't think it did make it in the show, that China, it was quite famously, there's a town that makes zips and buttons, and I think that's in our apparel episode. But I didn't realize there are lots of towns in China that are specialist hubs. It's a political.
There's the town that only makes Christmas decorations.
Christmas decorations, yeah. We did that on another show. It's a political decision. It's actually a decision to create hubs of excellence in China to be competitive with the rest of the world. What a bold thing to do, to say, okay, we're just going to have towns that do one product. And we're going to be brilliant at it.
Can I just say that the one thing also that I hadn't understood about that was that it's not just that somebody is really good at making it, they're there. The point is the entire ecosystem of their suppliers is also there. So, it's the people that make the motors that go into your blender. They have to be in the blender capital. So actually these go, Adam.
No, I was just going to say, for me, centers of excellence, one of the things that I had sort of not really paid attention to or taken for granted is a country like Bangladesh, who, because they've become a center of excellence when it comes to apparel and clothing, that lifted and changed the entire economy of the country. Before that point, most people were, I believe, farmers. It was a very poor country, and then they specialize in clothing, and now it is lifted something. I think it's something like 1.6 million people out of poverty. Don't quote me on that, but it is that principle that all of a sudden you're not having to just do hand to mouth farming. You can actually have a career that is going to span your life and send your kids through school, etc., etc. And I'd never thought about it in that sort of sense. Just the impact that one specific industry could have on an entire country.
I think, just to say, we'll get on to later on about some of the politics of some of the things we cover, but and what we felt was appropriate to put in a series like this, and what's actually would be more appropriate for a news show. But we could probably get on later on to how the rights and wrongs of low pay in the garment trade in countries like Bangladesh, when in fact there's this huge benefit to a community from that sort of centering of a kind of global trade, of a business. But that's that's maybe for later on. But that's the slightly the more heated conversation between us all.
No, Steve, I think you're hitting on a couple of key areas, and let me dig into that for a little bit. I'm always fascinated by people who aren't subject matter expert in supply chain or just getting for the first time. When we start to unravel supply chain all the way from source to recycle, reuse, repurpose, or waste, how their eyes just open up and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't know. How do I, get information here? Can you share some of the discoveries that you uncovered, or some of the learnings that you put together when the chain, for example? What didn't you know when you developed this, and what do you know now?
That's too long to list. Sure. What's our favorite fact then? Discovery fact from this series, one by one.
Well, you could say,
Oh.
because I've just been talking about Bangladesh, we could talk about the fact that in Kantamanto market in West Africa, they receive 15 million items of used clothing every week, and they get that from the back end of the fast fashion industry. And then ultimately a lot of it ends up as landfill. We can say, oh, that's a big negative, but it also just ties into exactly your point, Steve, that it also keeps thousands and thousands of people employed in Bangladesh. So it's easy to sit there and go, oh my God, look at all these problems, fast fashion is terrible. Yet it keeps an entire country, with a lot of its citizens employed. Not an entire country, but you get my point. So I think for me, it was the impact that the fashion industry was having on waste in another part of the world from where it was bought, where it was worn, where it was sold, and that was fairly eye-opening for me.
Okay, I've got two. I'm going to give you two because I can't choose between them. My first is, I love this fact, is that half of all tomatoes eaten in Europe are grown in Almeria, Spain. And they're only grown in Almeria, Spain because they have, it's the world's biggest covered area of agriculture in the world. You can see it if you're watching this podcast on Google Maps. You can see it from space. That's absolutely extraordinary. And how amazing are people to have achieved something like that, to create food so efficiently. Second is, for the healthcare episode, is that the active pharmaceutical ingredients are mostly made in China, which is a profound strategic weakness for the entire world, where you are relying on one country to provide the essential active ingredient for most drugs, and that one country controls it. That actually is extraordinary. China and India have I think it's 84% the market, some huge percentage of the market. So they were my two. John?
10% of all tomatoes grown globally go into ketchup, just to go back to ketchup. There you go.
And
we're going to start trying to
on
outdo each other with facts in a minute, aren't we?
I've lost the facts, but the other amazing thing I thought was that I think it's about half the world's tomatoes are now grown in China, and a lot of your Italian tomato paste is made with Chinese tomatoes, because all you have to do is grow them in China, ship them to Italy, pulp them in Italy, and now they're Italian. So I thought that was quite an interesting one.
Were you surprised on the impact that the consumers have on supply chain, and how little the consumers understand how they impact supply chains?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people are becoming more aware how they can impact supply chains now. I think that's one of the things that's come across through the series, is that I think previously we just expected things to be there, and now we're kind of lifting the lid on some of the waste and some of the kind of poor practices that have gone on, that people are making an impact now. And I think they can make a difference with what they choose to buy. And that's probably one of the kind of key things that has come out of that. And there's definitely a kind of a move towards that kind of endeavor.
Also, people within the supply chain reacting to, to a certain degree, bad practices, or the realization that things aren't potentially sustainable. And then you see people within the supply chain trying to rectify the problem themselves. So it's a sort of, a symbiotic relationship between the consumer and supply chain suppliers, managers, manufacturers, in order to try and rectify some of the problems that we have.
Yeah, but then just to remind ourselves, this is something we cover in the food episode, is that you can only, as a consumer, make decisions about the products you buy if you know where they come from. Yeah. You can only make decisions about, I'm not going to buy that, I don't know, that ketchup or something because it comes from a country of something you don't approve of, if you know where it comes from, if it's not been bottled somewhere else and labeled somewhere else. And I think we go into that in the show. There has to be some honesty in the origins of items, and for consumers to be empowered enough to make decisions.
Absolutely. I think, but the supply chains are so complex, you're talking 15, 20 tiers. It's kind of, that's one of the difficulties that manufacturers kind of have to kind of deal with.
Yeah, you don't want to have like I don't know, genetically modified tomatoes in your ketchup. The chances are it's going to be very hard, unless you're looking at labels and it's very well advertised, to trace maybe where that's from.
You had access to supply chain professionals to help trace all the products. one of the things that is you brought out is how difficult it is for the consumer to understand where their products came from, where they were manufactured, and who put it together. Give me a sense. You had access to supply chain experts. How difficult was it to get down to those source of the beginning of the supply chain?
Look, it's really hard. I think every product has its own little journey from, from field to plate or from quarry to whatever it becomes. It's really tough, and I think even having people who are inside the business, you can't just pick up the phone and get someone to just easily reveal where things come from. I mean, look, as we know from making this, is that every company has its own supply chain Bible. I mean, they've got most businesses will have it very carefully recorded, but whether they want to tell you or is another issue. I mean, John B did many of the interviews, and I think for a lot of the people we spoke to, we didn't trouble them so much for help trying to do the tracing because we were across most of that ourselves, weren't we, John?
But that's also because they have different regulations. Sorry, John, different regulations in different countries. So therefore, what we expect our labeling to be like may not be the same as tomatoes imported from China or another country. So if they don't have laws saying you've got to tell everyone what's in your product before it leaves our country, then it arrives in your country without the full ingredients on it, because by law it doesn't have to. So
I think also just one of the other things is that it's great that we come to this not being supply chain experts, because it could be very daunting a task to make a 6-part series about supply chain. I mean, John and I, when we were at the ASCM conference last year, we met all sorts of really interesting people who worked in different businesses. And I remember we met someone who was across the supply chain of car seats. And you think that's an enormous supply chain just to make a car seat. I mean, we're trying to do electric vehicles or hamburgers from lots of different directions, and here's someone whose career is a single item in an automobile, and that's obviously in its own extraordinary supply chain. So to expect that you can ask someone to just help you is just not possible for someone to just lay out the map for you.
That takes you to this amazing thing that we've gone from sort of just in time to just in sequence manufacturing. And I found that fascinating in the transport episode. The evolution, which, Henry Ford sort of kicks off, and then Toyota kind of flips on its head with the just in time. So Henry Ford, very integrated supply chain, owns everything from top to bottom. It's my wood, coal from my mines. That's how I control it. To the Toyota just in time. And now this just in sequence, where they'll be supplying the seats in the order of the color that they need to be made. So the consumer wants a red trimmed seat and his car is going to be purple. So that seat has to meet the purple car, and they do it day in, day out. And I mean, that is amazing. But just leaping back to the transparency, we spoke to a lot of people who felt that transparency was really important in supply chain, and that we were pushing, and who were also pushing there, and sharing information between companies in particular industries. But obviously that is something that we need to work on more, because obviously it's hard for them to be transparent, particularly with us, because we're going to put it on TV. But even between the companies, I think transparency is maybe something that's still a work in progress.
It's also hard for some companies to be transparent, because what certain disruptions in the supply chains that we've had over the past couple of years have shown is that some companies, manufacturers of cars or phones or whatever, they don't even know where certain elements of their product are actually sourced from, because they're so upstream, if that's the right word, Abe, they're so upstream, that it's 15 tiers down. So when there's a disruption with it, they're like, well, hang on a second. It's almost like these things appear out of the air. But no, one center of excellence that's just had a tsunami, the industry's collapsed, and now you can't finish your product off. What's the famous one with Ford with the badges?
Yes, the golden screw. Yeah, they had some a snafu with the badges for, I think it was Lightning trucks.
Yep.
And badges haven't come in. Hundreds of thousands of Lightning trucks are now stuck waiting for this one key element, this golden screw. Nothing can move without it.
It's interesting. Among the things that I really like about the documentary is that for every challenge, there are supply chain professionals, there are companies that are attempting to solve them in a really sustainable manner. I think there's the intent there. Here, what are the biggest issues that supply chains face today, and what are the solutions that you're seeing that are really moving the industry forward?
I think what we obviously is clear is that companies obviously want to be good. They want to they don't want to spoil the planet. They do want to give you products at the lowest possible cost with the highest possible quality. Most companies are good actors and want to give consumers what they want. But of course there are problems, but those companies are also looking for solutions. And I think what we really try to do is try to push is actually look at the challenges of supply chain, maybe some of the issues that the chain causes, but also how they're trying to solve those problems with like electronic waste and recycling old phones and taking out rare earth metals that out of products that exist already, rather than having to take them out of the ground. There are some, I think, some of the most interesting things in the show are about the solutions, about what people are trying to do to fix maybe the impact of their creating their product has on the environment.
And one of the key things that was coming up a lot was the kind of move towards a more circular economy. That was definitely something that most of the experts we talked to wanted to kind of discuss and were kind of very passionate about, was this ability to, instead of having a linear chain, finding a ways to bring back the materials that have been used and reuse them. I mean, with electronic waste, like Stephen said, that's a big issue. I mean, there's the amount of kind of copper and gold and rare earths that are locked away in the phones that we've just kind of put in our drawer or kind of chucked away. I think there is a potential for a huge economy there. So I think
I think the end is actually a big part of the story, because for all these products that are created is what happens to them when we don't want them anymore. And the issue with with phones and things is that they're valuable. The stuff in phones is valuable, and there is a reason for companies to try and find out how to harvest them, because it saves money, and companies are about making money. And so solutions that are driven by a sort of a process that increases revenue are obviously much more palatable for companies, but they still want to do stuff that is helpful. I mean, look at the apparel episode. It's all about, it begins with waste. It begins with clothes that we finish with and then send out to Africa to sit in a market where secondhand clothes are sold. That is that's a huge problem. And then the things they don't want end up in landfill. But still, that episode wasn't so bleak that there weren't solutions. There are still ways that companies are looking at trying to backcycle and recycle cotton and mixed fiber materials so that they can be reused.
It seemed like some industries are perhaps a little bit further on than others, and certainly in the automotive sector, virtually every part of an old car is stripped down, melted down, reused. There are whole, amazing factories where, the car goes through and you see it disassembled in the way that it's assembled. And those seats can be saved and the metal can be saved. Really, really impressive. And then perhaps that, I don't know, but perhaps that's because it's a higher value object. And the lower value objects, it's harder to do that. So a blouse from a fast fashion company, where the ingredients are mixed as well. So, there's an element of choosing your input material and making things so that they can be recycled. And I think the car manufacturers, for instance, in their choices of plastics, the kind of plastics they use are influenced by how they can reuse those plastics at the other end. So, there's some examples out there of the way forward, maybe.
Adam, you and I had a number of conversations about that apparel episode, and specifically some of your personal takeaways from it. And I want to, double down on what John B is, focused on, the T-shirt when we trace that. And there was a line in the documentary that if you want to pay $10 for a T-shirt, somebody way down the line is only making pennies a day. And, give me a sense of, what your takeaway from that was.
I think it goes back to the center of excellence sort of question. I mean, it obviously costs, wages are to a certain degree proportionate depending on the country and, depending on their economy. There are certain complaints of low pay in places like Bangladesh and what have you. But I think for me, it was more that you get a t-shirt that only costs $10. And the expectation of consumers nowadays is that they're only going to wear it 3 or 4 times. And I think that was what was most shocking to me, because I personally buy a t-shirt and I want it to last. I invest in a t-shirt because I like its design or I like its color, and I want it to last. And it doesn't cost, it might cost $20, or it might cost $15, it might cost $35, but I want it to last for as long as it can possibly do. And I think for me, one of the big sort of surprises was that people are so willing to spend their hard-earned money on fashion that they will literally give away a month later, five weeks later, even though they could keep that t-shirt and continue to wear it possibly for another 2 years. And I think I found that, I think I'm a slightly different generation, I think, of sort of consumer and shopper. I'm a bit older, but it was surprising how the sort of culture of fashion has become a lot more throwaway compared to my day,
Can I just add in, just to this is where Adam and I will start to spar on the point of fast fashion, is that we also have to bear in mind you've got companies that are making a product that consumers want, and the fact that they don't last as long is because the material will be cheaper, thread count will be lower, you can't put them through the washing machine many times. They're actually making a product that actually fits the behavior of the consumer. They're not making something that lasts for 10 years.
And they're not going to affordable clothes, which is the point we've had debate before.
Right, is that it's affordable. We have never lived in a time where clothes are inexpensive, food is inexpensive. We have systems and like companies making stuff that means that the poorest people can afford things that once that were out of reach. And the problem isn't with producing it. Those companies that make, like we profile in the show, that can make a t-shirt, design it and print it off and make it in 2 weeks are incredible. That's incredible. What an extraordinary company that can design a t-shirt and make it in 2 weeks and get it in the shops in London or New York or whatever, within a month. That's extraordinary. What a fantastic and efficient company. The problem's with what you do with it when you don't want it. That's the problem. That's the problem for the chain. The chain is make the stuff for people, but then let's have a way of dealing with it when we don't want it. Let's find a way of usefully recycling it or turning it into something else, putting it into a circular supply chain. And that goes across for all products. So I think we can look across and think, God, this is terrible, from a position of where we're quite comfortable and I can afford a $40-$50 t-shirt, but lots of people can't. And those companies provide a service for people who have less money and maybe have different behaviors, which I'm not going to say is a bad way to live. Might be a good way to live, but the problem is what you do with it afterwards, and companies have to bring those solutions, I think.
And the same is true of plastic within the food episode, because we debated that as well, Steve. My initial one was, single-use plastic's terrible and rah. But when you actually dig into it and the history, you realize that plastic has revolutionized the food supply chain, and has changed the way that we consume food and changed the way that we send food all around the world. And the problem isn't per se plastic, it's what we do with it at the back end,
Absolutely,
so we need to come up with solutions to deal with our plastic, or come up with bioplastics, or, but it's not, we need plastic. We can't escape from the fact we're always going to need plastic. It just depends what we do with it at the back end that's going to have the most impact.
Absolutely. I think, look, what's one of the things you want from the series is that people from supply chain watch it, and maybe who work in supply chain, and say, I'd never thought of that. And in fact, I'm the person who can make the difference. I'm the person who's in charge of this particular product or something, and I've learned something, and maybe it's on me to come up with a solution, because really, consumers can only go so far. It's up to companies to look at, the apparel episode and say, okay, we can do something about that. Look, I'm saying that, and lots of companies are trying to do something about it. They are trying to find ways to create materials that are recyclable, but hopefully it's a prod. Anyway, the series is a prod.
Yeah, I mean, it goes right through to the sort of delivery end of it as well, because I was quite surprised. I think it came out again in the electronics of the transport episode that needing to have your product delivered the next day is very expensive. And, in fuel, in pollution, in manpower, etc. If you could just wait an extra day, the van has to come to your neighborhood half as many times, uses half as much gas, creates half as much waste, etc. So some small changes from consumers can sort of have a ripple effect through.
Stephen, you brought up this topic before about sort of the nationalistic perspective, and we had a number of conversations about not being, not providing an opinion, but more on facts, on, tracing the products through. But yet we found it very hard not to have a perspective on companies, on countries that are attempting to either corner or gain a competitive advantage. The chip episode, obviously, the comms episode when we talked about chips and China, their desire to control chip manufacturing. We had a lot of conversation about that. Dig into, some of that topic for us.
China obviously plays a really big role across all episodes in this series. Lots of stuff is made in China. And obviously from perspectives of, say, the US and the UK, you slap tariffs on China. There's the lots of things we read in the press are about China dumping steel in the US or putting it through Mexico. China is framed in a way that it's the enemy of the West. We didn't really want to put that as a thread through the show. The companies in China are just making stuff. Companies in the US are just making stuff, and they are in competition with each other. We didn't want to present any one particular country in a way that would suggest there is right or wrong or good and bad. This is about people making products. It's about supply chain. It's about the connections between countries and businesses. We didn't make the show to have a political opinion about whether or not China behaves badly on the international stage when it comes to trade.
So we talked a little bit before about the global nature of it and the dependencies on China, on other countries. And while they may have some vertical supply chains, we talked about it in the transport episode, for example, on electric vehicles. When we talked about some of the other products, their dependency on Europe, on the US, on, the Israel, as well as Japan and other countries for the components to manufacture the processes, it's hard to unwind the global supply chain.
I think so. I don't want to over talk, but I think Yossi is great in the show in saying we all rely on China, but China's, one of the world's biggest markets. You've got to be in China, but all those companies in China are still reliant on other countries. You can't, alone make most products. I mean, China's pretty self-sufficient, but you really do need to have the expertise of Dutch companies that create chip making machines. You do really need the US to supply certain things in the UK. So the interconnectedness is impossible to unwind. I mean, look, the pandemic showed you what happens when you shut down global trade. You can't just push a button and it starts up again, because those connections are so complicated and the relationships are so difficult that you end up being, like John mentioned earlier, waiting for a badge to put on a truck before you can put it out because it's made somewhere that is not within reach.
So, and the cost of moving away from that is prohibitive as well. I mean, in the comms episode, we talk about the kind of the desire to kind of set up chip fabs elsewhere, but that's billions of dollars. That's 30 years of expertise that needs to be trained up in these countries. It's not something that you can just change overnight.
And also, we talk about China being this massive manufacturing hub that the world is reliant on, and they're pretty much self-sufficient for this and that, but they are reliant on us buying the goods as well. I mean, I know that's an obvious statement, but it is quid pro quo. So sort of politics aside, it is one company going, right, where do we sell to? So no matter what the bigger picture is, everything still needs to carry on working, no matter how obviously different countries feel about each other. The trade still has to happen. Otherwise everything collapses.
Final question, gentlemen. Let me hear from each one of you. Did anything change for you after you made the documentary and you saw some of the other episodes? John B., you start us here.
Well, I think, the one thing that struck me as just how incredible this web is, this kind of symphony, effectively, of supply chains, of people trading with each other. This is a symphony with no conductor, except the whole world. And this produces civilization. You know, our civilization relies on all these different people all the way down the line, all over the world, for the simplest thing, for your cup of coffee in the morning. And that kind of stunned me. And then the other things, I think, just, you know, when we're critical sometimes about pollution or about, you know, industrial waste, we have to remember that some of these countries are only doing what we in the West did 100 years ago, 150 years ago. It's very similar. If you look at pictures of, I think, Philadelphia from the sort of turn of the century, smog everywhere, you know, it was churning out steel because we needed steel, you know, and that steel made life better for a lot of people. So I think, you know, there is something really amazing and positive about the kind of 30 years of collaboration that we've had globally, and that's given us this incredible society.
I love that.
Incredibly rich
One of the
society.
things, you know, one of the things that came through in the documentary is that we trace the origin, not just in current times, but we give the history of how we got here. And I found it so fascinating, you know, on each one of the series and on each one of the products, going back to origin and the spice trade from thousands of years ago being the foundation for some of the spices that we use today. And the establishment of countries are based on food transportation. So I found that very fascinating. Absolutely.
And it's not just the spice trade. You know, when we started digging deeper, you found out 3,000 years ago the Egyptians are trading with the Mediterranean to get their olive oil, and the wine's going here and Germanic wine's going there. And this is thousands and thousands of years ago. You know, people were making that. You had your supply chain managers 5,000 years ago making decisions about where their dates were going to go. You know,
I mean, it's because it's a distinctly human trait. Is trade. It's a distinctly human trait, and I think I made this series and I just thought, God, aren't humans brilliant? Aren't we brilliant? I mean, look at what we do. You know, you've got companies that trade. It transcends the like nations and border states and things. Companies just work together as best they can to create a product that people want and to deliver it to them at a price that they can afford. And that's amazing. I mean, the Almira and the tomatoes, and that's amazing. All these things that we cover in this show are amazing. And although there are kinks and problems in the stories with things like pollution and the cost of the planet, all of these companies just want to do better, and they don't want to mess the world up. And they are all trying, and they are all trying to come up with solutions. So I felt, you know, very optimistic off the back of this.
Yeah.
I know there's moments where you know, like in apparel especially, where you feel, God, this is quite terrible, but actually, you know, there's such willingness to change and do things better that I think, you know, hopefully people will feel the same. They'll watch this and slightly be awestruck, but about how incredible supply chain is.
It's very much how we've all come to expect things, but I think that's really the kind of the key element. We expect it, and it arrives, and that's an absolute wonder. And it's only when things break down that we actually kind of realize what these supply chains have to go through to get us what we need, and the fragile nature of it. It's not as fragile as we think, because actually there's always a solution. People, you know, when things break, people find a way around it. And that's been one of the kind of interesting things. You know, we talk about, you know, the difficulties during the pandemic, or when the Suez got blocked, or a tsunami's hit, but the supply chain finds a way around that. It doesn't all end. There's a bump in the road, but they find solutions. And I think that's what supply chains have kind of shown me, that there's always a solution. You know,
yeah, that's a really interesting point. There's a line in one of the episodes is that, you know, we all expect full shelves when we go into a store, but we should be really surprised that there are full shelves to begin with. And I think to your point is that the system works. There have been disruptions, as you know, we've all experienced over the past 3 to 5 years, significant disruptions, but yet the supply chains do find solutions, to your point.
I think it goes back to what John was mentioned earlier about a circular economy. I think that's what I take away from it is, you know, I've always bought secondhand clothes, but now I buy more secondhand clothes than ever before. after making the apparel episode, because I think if someone goes to the effort of making something and manufacturing it, then I will endeavor to keep it alive as long as possible. So I think making this program has affected my consumer behavior with regards to apparel in quite a marked way. That from now on in, the majority of my clothes will be secondhand, whether that's from internet sites, auction sites, whether that'll be from thrift shops and what have you. I will just give it that extra year's wear. I will give it that extra 2 years wear, and then maybe ultimately it will end up as landfill, but there will be a pause before that happens, and actually I quite enjoy it, because I spent years shopping, going through the rails, when I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s, and I love that. Now I love a slightly different version of shopping. So there you go.
Although Adam's just had a second child only a few weeks ago, so he probably can't afford any clothes now.
I don't have time to go shopping.
It's really interesting because when we started to, the discussion about this, we knew there were stakeholders across the supply chain. And one of the things that the documentary really focuses on, there are companies, there's policymakers, there's media, there's consumers, there's patients, and the extended supply chain on all the suppliers working together. It's harmonized, process, and yet it's fragile. And we saw how fragile it is when we see the disruptions. But yet, John, you said it right. The solutions are always there. We just need to, work harder at finding those and using those up front as opposed to on the back end. I wholeheartedly agree. Final comments, gentlemen.
Final comments. Oh, what to say? I mean, it's been really enjoyable. I mean, I think we've all worked on very, very different shows throughout our careers, and made shows about UFOs and mysteries and crime, and this has been truly enjoyable. I got to read lots of books. We got to have lots of interesting conversations. We argued a lot about what should be in the show, and I think we made 6 great documentaries that, and I hope that people enjoy them as much. And they watch them as much as we did making them.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I can't express my appreciation, not only for your willingness to take this project on, but to make it come to life. And the consumers, the patients, I think the concept of the chain, how the world works, is dead on. And I think most individuals are not going to be not only surprised, but I think enlightened by the information that you guys provided. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has been an extraordinary conversation. It was a wonderful opportunity to talk to the individuals who created the documentary and realize how connected we are all across the globe. Thank you, Stephen, Adam, John, and John for joining me on the first episode of the podcast. A special thanks to everybody listening in today, to The Chain. The documentary will be streaming soon and available for you to watch. Be sure to check back with the podcast for more details on where and when it'll be displayed. Finally, I invite you to join me again for our next podcast. Coming in September, it's a special live episode from ASCM Connect North America, our conference in Austin in September. I'll be speaking with Richard Crawford about the complexities, innovations, and solutions towards a more resilient and sustainable global supply chain. Until next time, thanks all.